Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. It's not every day when you find a vintage computer thrown away in the garbage, let alone a Compaq Portable 1, one of the earliest IBM-compatible machines and Compaq Computer Corporation's very first product. I've been collecting vintage computers for over 10 years now, and this machine has been in the back of my head for a while. These early portable computers are very fascinating to me, and the Compaq Portable is truly a piece of history. Yes, that's right, portable. You might laugh when you hear that today, considering that this thing weighs 28 pounds and is about the size of a modern desktop computer, but it had a handle on the top, therefore, it's portable. In all seriousness, this was an extremely influential computer, despite it not being the first portable or even IBM-compatible machine. The Osborne 1 is regarded as the first portable computer to be commercially successful. However, it was not an IBM clone and actually predated the IBM PC by about 4 months. The Compaq Portable, on the other hand, was designed to be compatible with the IBM PC. Although you'll often hear people refer to it as the first ever IBM PC clone, that actually isn't the case. Columbia Data Products introduced what is considered by many to be the first IBM clone, the MPC 1600, in June of 1982, less than a year after the IBM PC was released and 5 months before the Compaq Portable was announced. But the Compaq Portable is noteworthy for being more or less 100% compatible with existing hardware and software designed for the IBM PC. Compaq had a major focus on compatibility and claimed that the Portable was the only personal computer from the time to be truly compatible with IBM's. This was huge for potential buyers. And most of all, Compaq had something that IBM just didn't have: portability. I mean, sure, you could carry your IBM PC and all its peripherals around with you, but who wants to do that? The Compaq Portable provided a self-contained system. The monitor was built in. The keyboard could be easily detached when you want to use it and reattached when you're done. It's even got a compartment next to the power switch to store the power cord. And there's a reason Compaq is often remembered as the first clone, because the release of the Portable 1 sent shockwaves throughout the personal computer industry. Within the first year, Compaq sold over 50,000 units and by 1986 had made almost $1 billion in revenue, all from a Texas-based company that most people didn't even know existed up until that point. This posed a pretty substantial threat to the Goliath that was IBM. You gotta remember, IBM was an extremely powerful company at this time, and they had a huge influence in the industry. So for a small company like Compaq to come along and challenge all of that, well, it was crazy. While IBM didn't create the first personal computer, the IBM PC soon became the de facto standard in terms of hardware and software compatibility. There were other standards out there, but the IBM PC standard would eventually rise to the top in terms of market share. But all of this wasn't solely because of Big Blue. Since the IBM PC used off-the-shelf components like the Intel 8088 processor, anybody could go out and purchase these parts and create a machine to compete with the IBM PC while still being compatible with hardware and software designed for it. That is, assuming you could create a BIOS for the machine on your own without copying IBM's, since this was copyrighted material. Both Columbia and Compaq were able to do this by following what's known as a clean room design. Eventually, a company called Phoenix Technologies created their own clone of IBM's BIOS that could be licensed to individual computer manufacturers, making it even easier to get into the clone market. The only other thing you need is the operating system, MS-DOS, which Microsoft was more than happy to license to you. Now, technically the IBM PC ran PC-DOS, but this was, for all intents and purposes, a rebranded version of MS-DOS, at least in its early years, created exclusively for IBM. The Compaq Portable was made available for purchase in early 1983, and now, almost 4 decades later, I finally got one. But I cannot take the credit for finding this thing. You see, these machines are sought after by vintage computer collectors, and even in a non-working state, can sell for around $100, sometimes even more. So I was very surprised when I got a message from Hero Rareheart here on YouTube, who said that she found one of these machines in the trash. Yeah, I'm not kidding you. Luckily, she recognized what it was and saved it from being put to death in a landfill. The machine itself doesn't work, but she offered to send it to me to see if I could resurrect it, and that's exactly what we're going to be trying to do today. So, huge thanks to Hero Rareheart for making this video possible, and without further ado, let's get right into it. Now, as you can expect from something pulled out of the garbage, this thing is dirty. There are marks all over the place, dust and debris lodged in various crevices, and even some damage to the exterior plastic, but we'll touch on this a bit later in the video. We can also see some stickers on the exterior of the computer that give us a clue about the previous owner, a company called Broker Service Agency in Providence, Rhode Island. There's also two other stickers that make reference to Atlantic Computer, who apparently had this computer contracted to them in the early 90s. Unfortunately, the problems with this machine go far beyond cosmetics, as it doesn't power up properly. Hero Rareheart told me that when the power switch is flicked, the fan would spin up, but nothing would display on the monitor. So let's open it up and see if we can figure out why. Luckily, the Compaq Portable is very easy to work on. Removing one of the two plastic covers gives you access to the internals of the machine, which is essentially a full-size desktop computer, with the exception of the added monitor. Inside, we've got three metal covers that give us access to the ISA cards, floppy disk drives, and the CRT and power supply respectively. And what's really nice is most of the screws don't even have to be completely removed, just loosened a bit to allow the covers to slide off. The first thing I discovered about this machine is that the internal fan gets power directly from AC, meaning that it powering on doesn't necessarily mean that the machine itself is working. And this is apparently a very common problem with this machine. The vast majority of eBay listings I found where a Compaq Portable is listed as non-working described this exact same issue. The problem is this doesn't really point us in a specific direction. The problem could be with the power supply, or the motherboard, or one of the ISA cards, or perhaps even the CRT. The first thing I tried to do was remove some of the ISA cards from the system and power it on again. What's cool is this Compaq has a couple of third-party cards installed. These machines typically shipped with 2 of the 5 slots filled up. This is evident when you look at the back and see that only 3 through 5 are labeled. Slot 1 contains a card that functions as both the floppy controller and a parallel output, and slot 2 contains the display card, which has both an internal header for the built-in CRT and an external port. This particular configuration includes 2 5¼ floppy disk drives, though you could opt to replace one of them with an internal hard drive. Or you could do what this machine's former owner did and get one of these, an ISA hard disk card. The other included ISA card adds additional RAM to the system. Unfortunately, even after removing all of these from the system, the machine still wouldn't post. Now you see that little red light? It's supposed to come on and stay on after the power switch is flicked. Instead, it just flickers for a brief second. Now, throughout this restoration process, I did a lot of research, and one of the resources I referred to a few times was the 8-Bit Guy's restoration video of this same machine. I'll have it linked up in the cards if you want to go check it out. He had the same problem. The red light on the motherboard would flicker, but nothing would power on except for the fan, of course. By using a multimeter, he discovered that the motherboard was only getting voltage for a split second, which explains why the post light flickered like that. Now in his case, removing all of the ISA cards from the system allowed the motherboard to power on and receive voltage properly. So it seemed like either the motherboard or the power supply was bad, and initially I believed the power supply was to blame. Though I wanted to research this issue a bit more before moving forward, so for the time being, I decided to shift focus to taking apart the system so that we can give it a much needed cleaning. As mentioned before, this thing is extremely dirty. Not only that, it's got that musty smell that indicates it once lived in a smoker's household. Now, we all know how bad smoking is for you. It's also terrible for computers, electronics, and pretty much anything with a fan inside. I wasn't able to see the fan entirely at this point, but I expected it was loaded with cigarette soot and in dire need of cleaning, as this is extremely typical. Once both plastic coverings are removed, only 3 pieces remain: the 2 larger side pieces and the display casing. I originally thought the display casing was removed by prying it from the side pieces, and it looked like somebody had tried to do this at some point. But this wasn't the case at all. You have to start with separating the 2 side pieces by removing the leather handle. This is done by removing 2 hex screws on the inside of the machine. I was able to remove one with just a screwdriver at a slight angle, but had to use a ratcheting wrench with a hex bit on the end to unscrew the other one, as the CRT housing was in the way. Luckily, the handle itself is in pretty great shape. Some slight prying is needed to separate the 2 side pieces from one another, and you have to remove 2 screws on each side. In my case though, some of the small plastic pieces had broken off, the worst being on the rear side. I just loosened this one a bit, and once I had the cover taken off, decided to use some adhesive to secure it back to the large plastic piece as best as possible. As you remove the side casings, the small doors for the power and expansion card areas come with. And at this point, focus shifted to the front, or in this case, the bottom plastic piece, which is removed by unscrewing 6 hex screws. This was quite difficult, particularly with one of the middle screws, as they all contained thread locker. But eventually, I was able to get each one properly removed, which finally separated the last plastic piece from the metal chassis. Well, not exactly. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is going to be taking apart the keyboard, because as you can see, the cable that connects the keyboard to the computer runs through this plastic piece that we want to remove and clean. Now, I could try to remove everything over here and unplug the cable from the motherboard, because this obviously is going to plug into the motherboard, right? Or I could just take apart the keyboard, and because I'm going to be taking apart the keyboard anyways to clean the plastic pieces on the keyboard, I'm just going to do that. Now, this is designed, obviously this is the way that you're going to use it. It's just like this piece is going to be connected and the keyboard is going to come out. Now, the keyboard separates from the computer through these 2 little tabs here, or these notches. So you push that one and you push this one here, and then the keyboard will separate, it'll come out, and you can see that the brightness knob has actually come off. That's the brightness knob that this goes over here. So we're going to set that aside so we don't lose it. So now we've got it separated here, and we'll see if we can rotate the keyboard like that. We have to be very careful. I guess like this. This is what we'll have to see. This is not the most convenient thing here, but okay, there we go. So now I can unscrew this. Okay, so there's the top of the keyboard. Okay, and right here, this is where the cable plugs in. And this just lifts up like that. At this point, the keyboard cable can be unplugged and run through the hole on the front plastic piece. I also unscrewed the keyboard from its bottom plastic casing before gathering all of the plastic pieces together to begin the cleaning process. Now, I was certain that all of these were going to need some retrobriting, as they looked a bit yellow, especially on the inside. But as I started to clean the exterior, I discovered that all of the yellowing was actually just a layer of residue from the cigarette smoke, and could be cleaned off with a magic eraser. The best example of this is the interior side of the 2 side panels. Watch how much of a difference the magic eraser makes. Look at that, it's like night and day. This just reiterated how dirty this machine was. It needed a lot of cleaning. I used the magic eraser and some Windex throughout this process and did a full deep clean of every single plastic piece. I also removed the 2 under contract stickers on the side casings, as they were falling off anyways, though I left the metal plate on. It took a couple of hours to get everything fully cleaned, which was much longer than I was expecting, but it was worth it in the end. I think the results speak for themselves. Now, the only piece I wasn't able to fully clean was the bottom keyboard plastic, which still contained some marks, even with a vigorous scrubbing of the magic eraser. I tried some baking soda and scrubbed it with a toothbrush for about 10 minutes, and this helped a little bit. I also did the same thing with vinegar, and I was pretty happy with the end result. Speaking of the keyboard, there's one aspect of it that I haven't even touched on yet, and that's the keys themselves. Now, the keyboard is usually one of the dirtiest areas on a computer since it is used, well, every time the machine is powered on, and this one was no exception. My initial impression was that the keys needed some retrobriting, but before we could do this, I needed to prepare the keys by cleaning them thoroughly. Luckily, there wasn't a whole lot of physical damage, aside from the small dent in the right side of the spacebar, which itself was a bit wobbly. I started by removing each key from the board, followed by each spring, making sure to separate the one for the spacebar as it is a bit stronger compared to the others. I then took a Q-tip dabbed in Windex to clean the crevices on the underside before moving on to the keys themselves. I went through the very tedious process of cleaning each side of each individual key with a Q-tip and Windex, which took a little over an hour. But again, it was worth it in the end. I then placed all of the keys into a plastic container. Now, for those who don't know, retrobriting refers to a chemical mixture that can be used to restore yellowed ABS plastics back to their original color. This is accomplished by using a hydrogen peroxide solution and ultraviolet light. I first discovered this through the 8-bit guy, back when he was called the iBook guy, and tried it out on my Super Nintendo in 2015, which worked pretty well. There are many hydrogen peroxide-based solutions you can use. In that video, I used 40 volume Salon Care cream, but just like the 8-bit guy, I discovered that this can lead to streaking on the plastic. This company also produces a 40 volume Salon Care liquid, which I decided to use for this video by submerging the keys in water mixed with this solution. Now, it is possible to use heat as a substitute for ultraviolet light, and this is exactly what the 8-bit guy did with the keys in his Compaq restoration video. So I decided to do the same thing. I followed his recommendation of heating a pot of water to be between 130 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 54 to 60 degrees for you people in Celsius land. Then just add the keys followed by the Salon Care liquid. The first thing I discovered about this method is it requires frequent maintenance, as you have to ensure that the temperature stays in this range, as you'll risk melting the keys if it gets too hot. And if the temperature falls below 130 degrees, the reversing will take substantially longer or may not even work at all. I left the keys on the stove for 3 hours, monitoring the temperature every so often, and here's what they looked like afterwards. There was a noticeable improvement, but the keys were still pretty yellow. In the 8-bit guy's case, it took only 2 hours for the keys to reverse, but his keys weren't nearly as yellowed as mine, so I expected this to take a lot longer. However, I tried a few more attempts with the heat method, each one spanning the course of a few hours, and didn't really notice any more major improvements. So I decided to switch to the tried and true method of using UV light. But I was out of hydrogen peroxide at this point, so it was off to Sally Beauty to pick up another bottle of the Salon Care liquid. So I filled up a container with the keys, water, and the peroxide solution, put plastic wrap over the top, and placed it under the UV lights. Then I closed the closet door and let it do its thing. 18 hours later, here's how the keys looked. Yeah, a major improvement. I was very satisfied with these results, so I set the keys out to dry and turned my attention to cleaning the interior of the Compaq. As it was pretty clear by this point that this machine once lived in a smoker's household, I wanted to remove all of the original components to do a deep clean of the chassis. I began with the fan, located right next to the power supply. I started to unscrew it from the metal piece it was attached to before realizing that the entire assembly could be removed by unscrewing another set of screws. Once I did that, things became much easier. Its cable had to be unplugged from the power supply. I also unplugged the cable that runs from the power switch underneath the fan. Both cables were tied together with one of these plastic cable fasteners that needed to be removed from a hole in the CRT assembly. I then began to unscrew this assembly from the rest of the case. There is one connector that runs through a hole in the bottom of the assembly which has to be removed. Once that's done, the entire assembly can be freely removed from the chassis. We'll come back to this later. With it removed though, we can get much easier access to the power supply. There is a single screw that attaches to the chassis from the rear where there is a nut that needs to be unscrewed. Once that is removed, the entire supply can be slightly pulled in to allow the screw to clear and then slid to the right. Yeah, if you haven't noticed by now, this is a very common theme with this machine, which is great. It makes it easier to take apart. Throughout this stage, I used a plastic box with dividers to store each of the screws and wrote on top to specify what was what. The power supply had 4 cables to remove. One large connector that ran to the motherboard, and 3 smaller ones that run to the 2 disk drives and the CRT. The large one in particular was quite difficult to unplug, but I was eventually able to get it out. And with that, the power supply could be fully removed from the chassis. Next, it was time to revisit the fan, which could now be fully removed from the metal bracket it was connected to. And as I anticipated, it was pretty dirty. I used a disinfecting wipe to clean the entire thing, including the fan blades, and did the same with the metal bracket. To clean inside these blades, I used one of the plastic prying tools from my iFixit kit to push the wipe inside, which worked pretty well. And here's the end result. Much better. But there was still one more thing in the power supply area. The switch. This had 2 screws on the back of the case to remove and a ground wire that had to be unscrewed from the chassis. I cleaned this up with a disinfecting wipe as well and also made sure to clean the cables. Next, it was time to begin cleaning the chassis itself, at least the area where the power supply is housed. Then it was on to removing the motherboard, which is also very straightforward. The board itself is contained on a metal tray that slides into the back of the machine. All you have to do is remove a few screws and unplug 3 cables from the board, which can be accessed by removing this panel on the bottom of the chassis. Just like on the power supply side, the most difficult cable to remove was the larger connector. The other 2 cables were for the keyboard and PC speaker respectively, which is contained in the CRT assembly. After that, the board could be removed from the chassis. The only other items to remove were the 2 floppy disk drives. I cleaned the entire chassis with disinfecting wipes and removed a ton of dirt and soot in the process. You've probably noticed this white cable bundle by now that contains all of the cables to connect the components together. It's secured to the chassis through those same plastic cable fasteners that we saw on the fan cable, so I just removed each one individually to clean underneath. I also did a deep clean of the CRT assembly. And here's the finished result. Now it was time to revisit the hardware issues with this machine to determine why it isn't powering up. At this point in the repair, I had pretty much assumed that the power supply wasn't working properly. And I'll be honest, I haven't done any power supply repair before, so out of curiosity I turned to eBay to see if anybody was selling a known working PSU, or just parts for the Compaq Portable in general. What I found instead was a very scarce selection of pretty high-priced items. It seems that most people who have one of these machines in non-working condition just choose to sell the entire thing instead of parting it out, and testing all of the parts to potentially sell some of them as working. Like I said earlier, these machines can go for around $100 in a non-working state, and that's not even including shipping. So you can see why this is the case. While I wasn't able to find a replacement power supply, I did come across this very interesting adapter board that was made specifically for the Compaq Portable. It's designed to allow you to use a Pico ATX power supply and a laptop-style power adapter to power on the Compaq Portable. However, there's nothing stopping you from using a regular ATX power supply, as the connector is obviously the same. Before purchasing it though, I wanted to see if anyone else had tried this out. I knew the chances were very slim, but to my surprise, I came across a YouTube video from NCommander. The video itself is on repairing a Compaq Portable 1, but he ended up purchasing this same adapter board to replace his PSU, and it worked just fine in his video. So, I decided to purchase one. Around the same time, I sent him a DM over on Twitter as I had a couple questions about the board that I wanted to see if he perhaps knew the answer to. And I'm really glad I did, because some of the info he gave me completely changed the course of this repair. Now, I need to give a huge thanks to NCommander for helping me out with this portion of the repair. I'll be honest, I don't have an electrical engineering background, but after speaking with NCommander and doing some research, here's what I believe is happening here. One of the first things NCommander told me is that the Compaq Portable's power supply utilizes a crowbar circuit. This is a form of over-voltage protection that can prevent damage to other system components attached to the power supply. It does this by shorting the PSU's output terminals, forcing the power supply to disconnect from the rest of the circuit. This is what's happening when we try to power on the machine. There's an initial burst of power, and then there's no power at all. This is why the red light on the motherboard only came on for a brief second. Essentially, this means that the problem with this computer isn't necessarily the power supply. There could still be something wrong with the power supply, or it could be functioning completely normally, and another component in the system is tripping the crowbar. So at this point, I was skeptical of my initial diagnosis. Now, in both the 8-Bit Guys and NCommander's video, they hooked up a different power supply in an attempt to get the machine to post. The 8-Bit Guy did this by jumping the leads, and NCommander used the ATX Adapter board. In both cases, when the power switch was flicked, a capacitor blew up on the video card. So the capacitor was bad, and it was tripping the crowbar circuit in the PSU, thus preventing the machine from fully powering on. If you recall from the 8-Bit Guy's video, when he removed the video card from the system and powered it on with the original power supply, the red light on the motherboard came on and stayed on, and there was proper voltage. But when he put the video card back in and powered it on, there was only that short burst of power again. When these non-Compaq power supplies were connected, the crowbar circuit in the original PSU obviously wasn't being utilized anymore, and thus the capacitors blew up. So at this point, I was thinking that the motherboard had a shorted capacitor. This is exactly what NCommander experienced. He found that the capacitor at C81 on the board was shorted and needed to be replaced. Now, that's not to say there isn't anything wrong with the video card. There could be a bad capacitor on it as well. But if you recall from earlier in this video, even after removing all of the ISO cards from the system, it still wouldn't power on. This would make sense if there was a short somewhere on the motherboard that's tripping the crowbar. This is why I find it incredibly valuable when people include the problems they encountered and the mistakes they made in their videos. Now, I'm not even going to try using the ATX adapter board because it will just result in a capacitor blowing up. But to put this theory to the test, I reinstalled the power supply and didn't hook up the motherboard to it. Then I got out my multimeter, unplugged the Molex connector from one of the floppy drives, and hooked up the probes to pins 1 and 3 to test the 12-volt rail. All that's left to do now is flick the power switch. We've got it in. Smoke test. Hey, there we go. We're reading proper voltage. Oh my gosh. Holy cow. We're going to test the 5-volt rail now. We'll do this by swapping the red to number 4, black to number 2, which is also ground. Plug this back in. There we go. And by the way, check this out, because we've got power flowing to the machine now. The floppy disk light, at least the one that's plugged in, is on. So there you go. The power supply works. The problem is something on the motherboard. At this point, I was comfortable reassembling the machine, except for the motherboard, of course. And that just about wraps up part 1 of this hopefully not more than 2-part saga. Yeah, I'm gonna have to split this one up because this video is pretty long as it is, and there's a lot more I have to do. We still need to do some more work on the keyboard, which is still disassembled, and obviously there's the motherboard. Now there's two routes I can go here. I can attempt to figure out what exactly is wrong with this board, which is again likely a bad capacitor, or try and source a replacement. Now, I'm certainly an amateur when it comes to recapping a motherboard. I have done some soldering before, but I actually don't have any of the equipment currently to be able to solder. And if the problem with this board is more severe than just a shorted capacitor, it may be worth just getting a replacement. But I'm currently looking into both of these solutions at the moment, and I think that is a good stopping point for part 1 of, let's call it the Compaq Portable saga. I want to give a huge thank you once again to Hero Rareheart for literally making this video possible by donating this machine to me. I also want to thank NCommander for helping me out with a portion of this video, and to the 8-Bit guy for his Compaq Portable restoration series that I referred to a couple of times throughout this one. And a huge thanks to all of you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this one, be sure to give it a like and get subscribed, and as always, I will see you all in the next video.